As he held her newborn son, a single tear fell from the giant's eye, revealing a past so tragic it would shatter them both. As the storm raged, the babies were born. When the giant held the newborn son, a single tear traced a path down his rugged face. That tear held the story of a lost family, a burning vengeance, and a tragic truth that would change everything. This is not just a story of survival. It's the story of how broken souls find each other in the dark. The night air, once cool with the promise of Montana frost, was now a searing wave of pine smoke and terror. Eleanor Vance didn't dare look back. She knew what she would see: the clinic, her home, the last sanctuary her husband Marcus had built, being devoured by a furious orange beast. Splinters rained down around her, hissing as they hit the damp earth. Her lungs burned, each gasp a ragged, desperate prayer. One hand instinctively cradled the swell of her belly, a shield of flesh and bone for the two precious lives kicking frantically within her. The other hand clutched a leather-bound journal to her chest as if it were her own heart. Marcus's heart. Two figures broke through the tree line ahead, their silhouettes stark against the hellish glow of the fire. They weren't fighting the flames. They were watching her, rifles held with casual menace. They were Corbin's men. She veered hard to the right, crashing through a thicket of buckbrush, the thorns tearing at her dress and arms. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. It was a fool's hope. She was a lone woman, 8 months pregnant, against armed men in a wilderness that was now an open cage. "Nowhere left to run, Mrs. Vance," a gravelly voice called out, closer than she expected. She stumbled, her ankle twisting on a loose rock, and went down hard. The journal flew from her grasp, landing pages first in the dirt. As she scrambled for it, a heavy boot slammed down beside her hand. She looked up into the cruel, shadowed face of a man she'd seen lurking around town for weeks. He grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "The Baron sends his regards. Now, be a good girl and give us the book." His partner moved in, reaching for her. This was it, the end of her life, and the lives of her children before they'd even had a chance to begin. She closed her eyes, a silent scream catching in her throat, but the man's touch never came. Instead, there was a sudden guttural cry, cut short with a sickening crunch. Eleanor's eyes flew open. A shadow had detached itself from the smoke, a figure so immense he seemed carved from mountain stone. The first man lay crumpled at his feet, unmoving. The second gunman, stunned, tried to raise his rifle, but he was too slow. A fist the size of a blacksmith's hammer met his jaw, and he fell like a felled tree. The giant stood over them for a silent moment, his broad back to Eleanor, his breathing the only sound besides the crackling fire. He wore a heavy duster, his features lost in the brim of a worn hat. He didn't look at the men he'd dispatched. He simply turned, his gaze finding her on the ground, clutching the journal. His eyes, deep-set and filled with a sorrow that seemed as old as the mountains themselves, held no malice, only a profound weariness. Without a word, he bent down, his massive frame eclipsing the firelight. He scooped her up as if she weighed nothing, his one arm a cradle of impossible strength around her back, the other securing her legs. She expected roughness, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. He started moving, not back toward the fire, but away into the vast, swallowing darkness of the Montana wilderness. The steady, rhythmic gait of the giant carrying her was a strange kind of comfort. It felt like the rocking of a cradle, a gentle sway against the violent chaos of the night. The motion pulled at a thread in her memory, and the world of fire and fear dissolved, replaced by the warm, lamplit glow of Marcus's study 2 weeks before. The air had smelled of antiseptic, old paper, and the faint, sweet scent of his pipe tobacco. He was standing by the window, but he wasn't looking at the peaceful streets of the small settlement. He was looking at her, his brow furrowed with a worry that had been his constant companion for a month. "They're not just sick, Eleanor," he'd said, his voice low and tense. They're being poisoned. Slowly. Deliberately. He moved to his desk and opened the leather-bound journal. Even then, it felt like a sacred object. He'd brought it out from a locked drawer, a place he usually kept only his most dangerous medicines. Corbin is cutting costs on the new rail spur. Instead of proper ventilation for the tunnel crews, there's nothing. They're breathing in mercury dust from the blasting shale, and it's settling in their lungs. He knows. He just doesn't care. He turned the journal for her to see. His elegant, precise handwriting filled the pages. It wasn't just a logbook, it was a testament. Names of Irish and Chinese laborers, dates of their visits, symptoms, coughing up blood, uncontrollable tremors, hair loss, confusion. He'd documented it all. It was a death warrant, not for the workers, but for the man who signed their paychecks. She had placed her hands on his, feeling the tremor of rage that ran through him. "Marcus, this is too dangerous. A man like Corbin. What am I supposed to do?" He'd shot back, his eyes blazing with a righteous fire she loved. "Let them die. Sign their death certificates and call it pneumonia." I took an oath. He softened then, his hands coming to rest on her swollen belly. "I have to think of their families. And ours. This journal is our insurance. If anything happens to me, you take this and you run. You don't stop until you reach the federal magistrate in Helena." 2 days later, something had happened. A spooked horse on a mountain trail, they'd said. A tragic fall. But when she'd seen Marcus's body, she saw the unnaturally neat bruise on his temple, a mark that no simple fall could have made. She knew. Corbin had collected on his debt. The memory evaporated as a cold gust of wind cut through the night, bringing Eleanor sharply back to the present. The warmth of the lamplit study was gone, replaced by an aching chill. She was no longer safe in her husband's arms, but being carried by a stranger whose name she didn't know, a silent giant who had appeared from the smoke like a vengeful spirit. He was her only hope, and she didn't even know if he was a man or a monster. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the shifting position of a sliver of moon in the ink-black sky. The giant, Silas, moved through the treacherous terrain with the certainty of a mountain cat, his steps never faltering, his grip on her never loosening. Eleanor lost all sense of direction, all sense of time, surrendering to the exhaustion that gnawed at her bones. She drifted in and out of consciousness, the only constant being the steady beat of his heart against her ear, a rhythm as solid and enduring as the wilderness around them. He stopped just as the first hint of grey dawn threatened the eastern horizon. They were at the base of a sheer rock face, a place that looked like a dead end. But Silas pushed through a curtain of thick frozen ivy to reveal a dark opening, a scar in the stone barely wide enough for his broad shoulders. Inside, the air was still and cold. He led them through a short natural tunnel that opened into a hidden basin no bigger than a homesteader's paddock, protected on all sides by towering walls of granite. Tucked against the far wall was a small, rough-hewn cabin, its timbered roof so covered in moss and earth it seemed to have grown from the mountain itself. He carried her inside and gently placed her on a narrow cot, the only piece of furniture in the room besides a small, crude table and a single chair. The cabin was Spartan, stripped of all comfort, a place for survival, not living. A stone hearth stood cold and dark. Firewood was stacked with military precision against one wall, and a few well-cared-for tools hung from wooden pegs. Silas moved with a quiet efficiency that was almost unnerving. He had a fire crackling in the hearth in moments, its warmth a welcome blessing against the biting cold. He took a bucket and disappeared outside, returning with water from a hidden spring. Then he knelt before her. Eleanor flinched as his huge, calloused hands reached for her face, but his touch was feather-light as he used a damp cloth to clean the soot and blood from her cheek. He tended to the cuts on her arms with the same surprising gentleness, his movements economical and sure. Who are you?" she finally managed to whisper, her voice raspy. He met her gaze, and for a moment the deep sadness in his eyes seemed to swallow the firelight. But he gave no answer. He simply rose, ladled some water into a tin cup, and handed it to her. As she drank, he checked the worn rifle that had been leaning by the door, his attention already on the world outside, on the dangers that might follow them. He was a guardian, a protector, but he was a ghost, a man without a name or a past. Eleanor lay back on the cot, the journal still pressed against her, and watched him. He took the chair, positioned it by the single shuttered window, and sat with the rifle across his lap, a silent sentinel in the growing dawn. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't just a target. She was being protected, and under the watchful eye of the giant, she finally slept. While Silas Kane kept his silent vigil in the mountains 100 miles away, the world was anything but silent. In a private railcar paneled with polished mahogany and furnished with plush velvet chairs, Bartholomew Corbin slammed a crystal glass of whiskey onto his desk, the sound cracking like a gunshot. The liquor sloshed over the rim, a dark amber stain spreading across a map of his expanding empire. "Incompetent fools!" he roared, his voice, usually so smooth and controlled, now ragged with fury. "An entire team, bested by one pregnant woman, and what, a ghost?" His second-in-command, a wiry man with nervous eyes named Peterson, stood rigidly by the door. "The reports are unclear, sir." "They say he was huge, unnaturally so, appeared out of nowhere." Corbin's lip curled into a sneer. "I'm not paying for campfire stories, I'm paying for results." He stalked to the window, staring out at the rugged Montana landscape his railroad was slowly strangling. That journal wasn't just a threat. It was an annihilation. It contained not just the names of the dead laborers, but financial records, shipping manifests, proof of a conspiracy that reached all the way to the territorial governor. If it surfaced, he wouldn't just lose money. He'd lose everything. He'd hang. He turned back, his eyes cold and calculating. The time for subtlety was over. The time for brute force had failed. Now it was time for cunning. "Get me a telegraph line," he commanded, "and find me Elias Thorne. Tell him the price has doubled." Peterson's already pale face went a shade whiter. Elias Thorne wasn't just a bounty hunter. He was a human wolf, a tracker who was said to be able to follow a hawk's shadow across barren rock. He was vicious, intelligent, and utterly without mercy. Sending Thorne after someone wasn't a threat. It was a death sentence. As Peterson scurried to obey, Corbin sat back down at his desk and pulled a small private ledger from a hidden compartment. He flipped through the pages, a list of names and figures, each one a thread in the web of corruption he had so carefully woven. He stopped at one entry. Trinity Springs. Sheriff Miller. $500 retainer. He picked up the speaking tube for the telegraph operator. "Get me a priority line to Trinity Springs," he said, his voice once again calm, silky, and far more dangerous than his rage. "I have a message for our good sheriff," he smiled, a thin, predatory slash in his handsome face. The hunters in the mountains were a blunt instrument. The real trap would not be sprung in the wilderness. It would be laid in a place of law and order, by a man sworn to protect the very people he was about to betray. By the second day, a fever had taken hold of Eleanor. It came on fast, a chilling ague that left her shivering violently beneath the thin wool blanket. Silas, who had been as still as the granite walls around them, sprang into a quiet, purposeful action. He ventured out into the biting wind, and returned with a handful of pine needles, willow bark, and a pale, mossy lichen she didn't recognize. He worked at the hearth, crushing the herbs with a stone, his movements sure and ancient, brewing a bitter-smelling tea that he coaxed her to drink. He tended to her through the long, dark night, bathing her forehead with cool water, his presence a constant, reassuring weight in the small cabin. As the fever peaked, the lines between the past and present blurred for Eleanor. She was back in the clinic, holding Marcus's hand, pleading with him. "Don't go, Marcus. It's not worth it. Please," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp, tears tracing hot paths down her temples. She felt a large, rough hand gently squeeze hers. A voice as low and rough as stones grinding together rumbled from the shadows beside her. "He shouldn't have left you." The words were hard, not gentle, yet they carried no judgment. They were a statement of fact from a man who knew the cost of leaving someone behind. Eleanor's eyes fluttered open. In the flickering firelight, Silas's face was a mask of old pain. "My Sarah," he said, the name torn from him, raw and unused. She had that same fire in her eyes, a will to fight, even when she knew the fight was lost. He said nothing more. He didn't need to. In that single, shared confidence, a bridge was built across the chasm of their silence. He had lost someone. He saw that same fire, that same loss in her. The knowledge settled deep in her bones, a truth more comforting than any empty platitude. When dawn finally broke, the fever had broken with it. Eleanor woke, weak but clear-headed, to the smell of wood smoke and brewing coffee. Silas sat by the fire, sharpening a hunting knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic shing, 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 a soothing sound. He glanced over, his eyes meeting hers. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement that she had passed through the crucible and survived. She nodded back. The unspoken questions still hung in the air between them, but they were no longer questions of fear. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a man, haunted by one of his own. They had spent 2 more days in the hidden cabin, a period of quiet healing where Eleanor regained her strength and the unspoken trust between her and Silas solidified into something tangible. But their sanctuary was a fragile one, and it was shattered by a pain so sharp and sudden it stole Eleanor's breath. She cried out, her hands flying to her belly as a powerful contraction seized her. It was too soon, far too soon. Silas was at her side in an instant, his face grim. He saw the truth in her wide, frightened eyes. The babies were coming. His knowledge of wilderness herbs was one thing, but the delicate, dangerous reality of a premature twin birth was another. He was a protector, not a doctor, and he knew the limits of his skills. To stay here, in this isolated cabin, would be a death sentence for her or the children, perhaps all 3. The world outside was filled with hunters and murderers, but it also held the one thing they needed, a chance. "We have to move," he said, his first decisive word since they'd met. "There's a town, Trinity Springs, a day's ride." The journey was a blur of controlled urgency. Silas procured a sturdy horse and a small buckboard wagon from a remote, abandoned homestead, his movements suggesting he knew this territory like the back of his own hand. He made Eleanor as comfortable as possible in the back, cushioned with his own bedroll and every spare blanket he owned. With every jolt of the wagon, another wave of pain washed over her, but she bit her lip and held on, focusing on the steady, broad back of the man guiding them toward an unknown fate. They arrived in Trinity Springs as dusk was painting the sky in shades of purple and rose. It looked peaceful, almost idyllic, with neat houses and a white church steeple rising against the darkening hills. Silas brought the wagon to a halt in an alleyway, his eyes scanning the street. It was then that a figure approached them, the 5-pointed star on his chest glinting in the lantern light. "Evening, folks. You look like you're in a spot of trouble," the man said, his voice warm and reassuring. He had a kind, weathered face and a fatherly demeanor. It was Sheriff Miller. Eleanor leaned forward, her relief so potent it was dizzying. "Please, Sheriff. My babies. They're coming." Sheriff Miller's expression softened with concern. "Well, we can't have that, can we? You folks are in luck. Our town doctor is just down the street. A good man. Let me take you to him." Silas remained silent, a large, unreadable shadow in the driver's seat, his hand resting near the pistol at his hip. The sheriff's smile was disarming, his offer a lifeline in a sea of despair. He was leading them to a doctor, he said, a safe place. And for the first time, looking at the lawman's reassuring smile, Eleanor allowed herself to hope. Sheriff Miller led them to a small, clapboard building at the edge of town, a faded sign reading, Dr. Alistair Finch, hanging crookedly above the door. The sheriff helped Eleanor inside while Silas tied the horse, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes never leaving the building's shadowed windows. The air inside didn't smell of carbolic acid and herbs, it smelled of stale whiskey and dust. The man who called himself Dr. Finch was thin and weaselly, with nervous, darting eyes and hands that looked more suited to dealing cards than delivering babies. He gestured for Eleanor to lie down on a stained examination table. Now, my dear, let's have a look," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. Sheriff Miller stood by the door, blocking the only exit, his friendly demeanor now feeling like a cage. Silas stepped inside, his massive frame filling the doorway. He didn't look at Eleanor. His gaze was fixed on the room, taking in every detail. The layer of dust on the medical instruments, the lack of any real supplies, the way the doctor kept glancing at the sheriff. And then he saw it. A slight bulge under the doctor's coat that wasn't fat. And on a small table, partially covered by a dirty rag, was the unmistakable glint of a syringe, already filled with a murky amber liquid. "Just a little something to ease the pain," the doctor said, picking up the syringe with a slightly trembling hand. As he approached Eleanor, Silas moved. He was not fast. He was simply there. One moment he was by the door. The next his huge hand had clamped around the doctor's wrist. The syringe fell, shattering on the floorboards. "I don't think so." Silas's voice was a low growl. Sheriff Miller's hand flew to his pistol. "Now hold on, friend." But Silas was already in motion. He twisted the doctor's arm, using the smaller man as a shield, as he shoved him toward the sheriff, sending them both stumbling backward. Miller's gun clattered to the floor. In 2 long strides, Silas was on him, one boot pinning the sheriff's gun hand to the floor, the other kicking the office door shut. "You made a mistake," Silas snarled, his voice a promise of violence. He grabbed the sheriff by his collar, lifting him effortlessly. "Who do you work for?" Miller's face was a mask of terror. "Corbin! It was Corbin!" Silas dropped him in a heap, his expression one of cold fury. He turned to Eleanor, his eyes telling her everything she needed to know. The hope she had felt was a lie, a cruel trick. He helped her off the table and guided her to the door. Behind them, the sounds of shouting began to echo from the main street. The trap had been sprung. They were alone again, with the wilderness ahead and a pack of wolves in human form behind them. They fled into a world turning hostile. Behind them, the lights of Trinity Springs were swallowed by the darkness. Ahead, the wind began to howl, carrying the first stinging needles of ice. A Montana blizzard didn't arrive. It attacked. Within minutes, the world was a maelstrom of white fury, the trail disappearing, the air so thick with snow it was hard to breathe. The wind masked the sounds of any pursuit, but it was a merciless protector. The old horse strained against the growing drifts, its breath pluming in the frigid air. Eleanor was gasping now, her knuckles white as she gripped the side of the buckboard. The contractions were coming faster, harder, a relentless tide of pain. "We can't stop," Silas yelled over the roar of the wind. The choice was made for them. There was a sharp crack, like a rifle shot, and the wagon lurched violently, throwing Eleanor against the side. A wheel had shattered under the strain, splintering into useless timber. They were stranded, helpless. Silas was out in an instant, lifting her from the wreckage. He wrapped his own heavy duster around her, a futile shield against the storm's fury. For a moment, even he seemed lost, a giant dwarfed by the sheer, elemental rage of the wilderness. Then, through the swirling curtain of snow, he saw it, a dark shape, a faint, angular shadow against the white chaos. A steeple. It was a small, abandoned chapel, its windows boarded up, its paint peeled away by years of harsh seasons. Silas kicked open the heavy oak door and carried her inside, out of the punishing wind. It was frigid, but it was shelter. Using his knife, he pried boards from a broken pew and, with the last of his tinder, managed to start a small, struggling fire in a stone alcove. "The babies!" Eleanor cried, her body arching in agony. "Silas, they're coming now!" All the hardness, all the warrior's instinct in him seemed to melt away, replaced by a focused, desperate tenderness. He knelt before her on the dusty floor, his huge, scarred hands, which had known only the cold steel of a gun and the brutal finality of a fist, now becoming the instruments of birth. Had he followed her pained instructions, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through her fear, he tore strips from his own shirt for clean cloths. He whispered words of encouragement, raw and clumsy, but more potent than any practiced sentiment. Through a haze of impossible pain, Eleanor pushed. The world narrowed to the sound of her own ragged breathing, the roar of the wind, and the steady presence of this giant. And then a cry. Sharp, furious, and gloriously alive, it pierced the heart of the storm. "A boy," Silas breathed, his voice thick with emotion as he wrapped the tiny, squirming infant and placed him in the crook of Eleanor's arm. But their ordeal wasn't over. Another wave of pain crested, and she cried out, her strength failing. "I can't." "Yes, you can," Silas commanded, his hand on her shoulder, his gaze locking with hers. "You have to." With one final, monumental effort, she gave a gut-wrenching cry, and a second life entered the world. A girl, smaller than her brother, but just as fierce. The blizzard raged on outside, but within the crumbling walls of the forgotten chapel, a profound silence fell. Silas looked down at the two infants, their faces pink and perfect, their tiny fists clenched against the cold. And in the flickering firelight, Eleanor saw not a warrior, not a giant, but a man completely undone, his face a landscape of awe, wonder, and a sorrow so deep it seemed to break him. The storm raged, but inside the chapel, a fragile peace held. Eleanor, exhausted but awake, watched the giant. He sat by the fire, holding her newborn son, cradling the tiny bundle in his enormous hands with an almost painful reverence. He stared down at the baby's face, and in the flickering light, his own rugged features seemed to dissolve, the years of hardship and grief falling away to reveal a man she had never seen. And then he was gone, lost in a memory so powerful it seemed to suck the warmth from the air. He was in another cabin, one filled with light and the smell of baking bread. A woman with hair the color of autumn leaves and a smile that could gentle a wild horse was pulling a fresh loaf from a cast-iron stove. A small boy, no older than 4, with his father's serious eyes, was running a carved wooden horse along the floorboards. The woman, Sarah, looked up and smiled. "He'll wear that thing down to a splinter, James." He was U.S. Marshal James Kane then. A man of the law, a man with a home. He knelt and scooped his son, Daniel, into his arms. The boy smelled of sunshine and sawdust. Later, Sarah's hand was on his arm, her brow creased with worry. "This man you're investigating, this Corbin, he's different from the others. He has no soul. He's just a greedy man building a railroad, Sarah. I've dealt with his kind before." "No," she'd insisted, her grip tightening. "He's a snake. And a snake will always bite." The memory soured, the warm light turning to a hellish orange. He was riding hard, returning from a 3-week patrol. He saw the glow from 10 miles out, a malevolent stain on the night sky. He rode his horse into the ground, his heart a cold, dead stone in his chest. He arrived to find his world reduced to a smoldering ruin. The cabin was an inferno, and there, lying in the dirt near the collapsing porch, was the little wooden horse, blackened and smoking. He fell to his knees, a sound of pure agony torn from his soul, a sound no one but the uncaring stars ever heard. He had found the tracks of 3 shod horses, and the distinct smell of kerosene. It wasn't a tragedy, it was an execution. The world swam back into focus. He was in a cold, dark chapel. The infant in his arms stirred, a soft, trusting sound. A single tear, hot and heavy, escaped James Cain's eye and traced a path through the grime on his cheek. He had failed to save his own son. He would not fail this one. Eleanor watched, her own heart aching. She said nothing. There was nothing to say, but in that moment she understood everything. The immense sadness, the self-imposed exile, the reason he fought to protect her, a stranger. She knew his name was not Silas, and she knew they were no longer just a woman and her protector. They were survivors, bound by the ghosts of the families they had lost. The blizzard blew itself out by morning, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and dangerously bright. The silence in the chapel was absolute, broken only by the soft, snuffing sounds of the 2 infants sleeping in a makeshift cradle fashioned from a wooden crate. Eleanor, though weak, felt a fierce, protective energy singing in her veins. She and Silas, she now thought of him as James, moved with a new, unspoken understanding. The shared ordeal of the birth had forged them into a team, a family. James knew this fragile peace was a mirage. Corbin's men would not give up. The moment the snow cleared enough for travel, they would be hunted again. They could not stay. "Your husband," he said, his voice quiet as he tended the fire. He mentioned a mentor, a doctor who taught him, Abe. Eleanor looked up, surprised he'd remembered such a small detail from their fevered conversation. Dr. Abraham Morris. He retired years ago. Lives in the foothills of the Crazies, alone. Marcus said he was the most stubborn, principled man he'd ever met. "Stubborn and principled is what we need," James said. "Can we trust him?" "Marcus trusted him with his life," she replied. It was their only chance. The journey was slow and agonizing. James, using skills that seemed limitless, fashioned a crude travois to drag behind the horse, creating a sheltered carrier for Eleanor and the twins. He moved with painstaking care, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, reading the snow for any sign of tracks that weren't his own. He was no longer just a silent guardian. He was a father, checking the infant's wrappings, making sure Eleanor was warm, his every action a testament to the vow he'd made in the chapel. They found Dr. Abe's ranch tucked into a box canyon, a place designed to be overlooked. A curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney, the only sign of life. As they approached, the front door of the cabin opened, and an old man with a shock of white hair and eyes as sharp as a hawk's emerged, a shotgun held steady in the crook of his arm. "That's far enough," he called out, his voice a gravelly bark. James brought the horse to a halt. "We're looking for Dr. Morris. This is Eleanor Vance." At the name, the old man's expression flickered. He squinted, his eyes moving from James's imposing figure to the bundled woman on the travois. Eleanor spoke, her voice clear despite her exhaustion. "Dr. Abe, I'm Marcus's wife." She pulled back the blanket to reveal the faces of her sleeping children. The shotgun lowered. The hardness in Dr. Abe's face dissolved into a mixture of grief and astonishment. He strode forward, his medical instincts taking over. "Good God, child, what in blazes has happened? Get inside, both of you. Get inside now, before you all freeze solid." He led them not into the small cabin, but to a sturdy-looking barn. Inside, he pulled on a heavy chain, and a section of the floor lifted away, revealing a set of stone steps leading down into the earth. Below was a warm, brightly lit space, a fully equipped underground clinic. "Marcus helped me build it," Abe said, a sad pride in his voice. "A place to weather any storm. Looks like the storm has finally arrived." He looked from the twins to the journal Eleanor clutched, to the weary, dangerous man standing guard. Corbin will come for that book. He always finishes what he starts. He closed the heavy trapdoor, the sound of it locking into place, echoing like a promise. This time, we'll be ready for him. The 2 days they spent in Dr. Abe's underground sanctuary were a surreal dream of peace. In the warm, lantern-lit clinic, Eleanor felt her strength return. Abe, with his gruff but gentle hands, pronounced the twins. A boy and a girl she had decided to name Marcus Jr. and Hope, small but perfectly healthy. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future. James watched over them, the hard lines of his face softening as he observed the small family, a ghost of a life he once knew. It was James who sensed it first. He was standing near the hidden ventilation shaft, a stillness coming over him. "Company," he said, his voice a low rumble. Abe grabbed an old brass spyglass and peered through a cleverly concealed peephole at the top of the stone steps. His shoulders sagged. "Miller," he spat, his voice laced with venom, "and he's brought a dozen of Corbin's dogs with him." The first shot was not aimed at the barn, but at the front window of the cabin. It was a summons. They were being flushed like quail. James moved to one of the narrow firing slits built into the cellar's thick stone walls, a rifle appearing in his hands as if by magic. Abe grabbed his own well-oiled Winchester and took up a position at another. "They don't know we're down here," Abe muttered. "They think we're cornered in the house." The siege began in earnest. For hours, it was a deadly game of cat and mouse. Miller's men peppered the cabin and barn with rifle fire, while James and Abe, hidden and protected, returned fire with disciplined precision. James was a master marksman, each shot purposeful, aimed not always to kill, but to disable, to disrupt. He fought with the cold, tactical mind of a seasoned lawman. Eleanor, after tucking the twins securely into a reinforced wooden crate in the safest corner of the clinic, refused to be a bystander. Her fear had been burned away, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She became their quartermaster, reloading rifles with steady hands, keeping ammunition organized, her movements as efficient as they were in an operating theater. When a ricocheting bullet sent stone splinters flying and one grazed Abe's arm, she was there instantly, cleaning and bandaging the wound under fire. "Damn it, woman, get down," Abe grunted. "Be still, or you'll bleed all over your own floor," she ordered back, her voice leaving no room for argument. Frustrated by the unexpectedly stiff resistance, the attackers changed tactics. A flaming torch arced through the air, landing on the dry roof of the barn above them. Soon, the smell of smoke began to trickle into the clinic. The cracking of burning timber became a terrifying drumbeat overhead. They were trying to burn them out. The heat intensified, and through the firing slits, they could see Miller's men gathering for a final rush, ready to storm the trapdoor as soon as the fire forced it open. Trapped, with a raging inferno above and a pack of killers waiting outside, the last sanctuary had become a tomb. The heat was becoming unbearable. Smoke, thick and acrid, coiled down the stone steps, making their eyes water and their lungs burn. The twins, sensing the growing panic, began to cry, their small wails a heartbreaking counterpoint to the roar of the fire above. Eleanor held them close, murmuring reassurances she didn't feel, while James and Abe took turns at the firing slits, their faces grim in the smoky haze. They were trapped in an oven, and it was only a matter of time. Then, a new sound cut through the chaos. A single, authoritative shout from outside. The sporadic rifle fire ceased. An eerie silence fell, more terrifying than the noise it replaced. James pressed his eye to the slit. He saw Miller's men backing away, clearing a path. A fine, black carriage, drawn by two perfectly matched black horses, was pulling up beside the burning barn. A man stepped out, dressed in an immaculate black suit, his movements calm and deliberate. Even from this distance, he radiated an aura of absolute power. Bartholomew Corbin had come to finish the job himself. He wasn't alone. Following the carriage was a heavy wagon. Two of Corbin's men jumped down and began unloading a tripod, a brass casing, and a multi-barreled weapon that made Dr. Abe's blood run cold. "A Gatling gun," Abe whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. He brought a Gatling gun to kill a woman and her babies. Corbin surveyed the scene with the cool detachment of a landowner inspecting a troublesome piece of property. He took a speaking trumpet from one of his men. "To the ghost in the cellar," his voice boomed, amplified and unnaturally clear. "Your little fortress is impressive, I admit, but the game is over." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Send out the woman and her husband's book of fairy tales. In return, I will grant you and the old man a quick death, a courtesy I did not extend to Dr. Vance." The cruel, mocking words sent a hot spike of rage through Eleanor. Beside her, James Cain went rigid. The raw hatred that emanated from him was so intense, it was almost a physical force. He stepped away from the firing slit, his face a mask of stone, and shouted a single word, his voice a roar of pure, unfiltered fury that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. "Corbin!" Outside, Corbin froze, the trumpet slipping slightly in his hand. That voice. He knew that voice. It was a ghost from a past he had tried to bury under a mountain of money and bodies. He snatched the spyglass from a subordinate, his hands trembling slightly as he raised it to the firing slit. For a second, he saw a face in the shadows, a face he had last seen in his nightmares, aged by grief but unmistakable. A look of pure, venomous shock crossed Corbin's features. The arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a snarl of disbelief and incandescent rage. It wasn't some random homesteader or hired gun. It was him. "Cain," Corbin breathed, the name a poisoned whisper. The fight for the journal was forgotten. This was now about erasing the one man who knew the true foundation of his empire. He lowered the spyglass, his eyes glittering with a new, murderous fire. "Level it," he commanded, his voice dropping to a low, chilling command. "Level all of it. I want nothing left but ash and bone." The rhythmic, terrifying thump, thump, thump of the Gatling gun's crank began. The air crackled with anticipation of the coming slaughter. Above them, a heavy roof beam groaned, glowing red. The fire was about to breach their sanctuary. "He's not the only one with secrets," Abe growled, moving to a heavy medicine cabinet against the far wall. He pushed it aside, revealing the dark, iron-banded outline of a hidden door. "Old Prospector's Tunnel comes out in the rocks behind the north pasture." James Cain looked from the tunnel, to Eleanor clutching the crying twins, to the firing slit where he could see the gunner taking his aim. There was no time for a choice. There was only the plan. "Abe, get them out, now," he commanded, his voice the unquestionable authority of a U.S. Marshal. "Don't stop for anything." He turned to Eleanor, his eyes boring into hers. "Keep them safe." Before she could protest, he was gone, a phantom moving toward the far end of the cellar. As Abe hurried Eleanor and the babies into the dark, musty tunnel, James kicked open the main trapdoor, unleashing a bellow of pure, defiant rage and a volley of rifle fire into the chaos above. It was the act of a madman, a desperate suicidal charge meant to draw every eye, every gun. It was the perfect distraction. While Corbin's men riddled the barn with bullets, James slipped into the tunnel behind his new family. He moved through the suffocating darkness with a speed that defied his size, emerging from a fissure in a rock outcropping 100 yards behind the enemy line. He was no longer the hunted. He was the hunter. He moved like a wraith through the chaos. The first two men went down without a sound. Then he came upon Sheriff Miller, who was trying to rally men to storm the burning barn. "Miller," James's voice was a cold whisper at his back. The sheriff spun around, his face turning to chalk. He fumbled for his pistol, but James's hand shot out, grabbing the barrel and twisting with a sickening crack of bone. Miller screamed and crumpled, his gun hand a useless, mangled mess. "You sold your soul for his silver," James snarled. It was a bad trade. He left the sheriff writhing and moved toward the Gatling gun. He fired twice, taking out the gunner and his loader. Then he turned his attention to the master of the massacre. Corbin, seeing his men falling and his plan crumbling, had drawn a silver-plated revolver, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "You're a ghost, Kane. You should have stayed dead." "You took everything from me, Corbin," James said, advancing steadily, his own pistol held low and ready. "You were a footnote in my ledger," Corbin screamed, firing wildly. A bullet tore through James's shoulder, staggering him, but he didn't stop. He fired his own pistol once, not at Corbin's heart, but at his hand. The silver revolver flew into the dirt. Corbin was disarmed, defeated. The remaining thugs, seeing their leader fall, scattered into the night. James stood over him, wounded, breathing heavily, the burning barn casting long, dancing shadows around them. He saw movement by the rocks. It was Abe, helping Eleanor emerge from the tunnel, the twins safe in her arms. Corbin's reign was over. The battle was won. James Kane, a giant of a man fueled by justice, stood victorious, his gaze fixed not on the devil he had vanquished, but on the family he had saved. 1 year later, the morning sun crested the peaks of the Crazy Mountains, flooding the valley with a clean, golden light. The town of Trinity Springs was no longer a place of fear. It was a place of healing. The children played in the street, their laughter echoing where gunfire once had. A new, honest sheriff wore the star that Miller had so thoroughly disgraced. And in the center of town, a new clinic stood, its windows bright and welcoming, a testament to the memory of Dr. Marcus Vance. Inside, Eleanor Kane, no longer Vance, finished bandaging a young boy's scraped knee. He ran off with a lollipop, and she watched him go, a gentle smile on her face. Her life was a tapestry woven from threads of sorrow and joy. She was a widow and a wife, a survivor and a healer, a mother. The clinic door opened, and James Kane stepped inside. He was no longer the ghost named Silas. He was the town marshal, a role he wore not with the weary burden of his past, but with the quiet dignity of a man who had found his purpose. He was still a giant, but the haunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep, steady calm. In his arms, he held their daughter, Hope, who was busy trying to grab the silver star pinned to his chest. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded, lifting Marcus Jr. from his playpen on the floor. The four of them walked out into the bright morning. They weren't just a group of survivors, thrown together by violence. They were a family, forged in fire and tempered by love. Their walk ended at the small cemetery on the hill, overlooking the town. They stood before a simple, elegant headstone that read, Dr. Marcus Vance. A good man who stood against the dark. Eleanor knelt, placing a small bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the stone. She traced the letters of his name with her fingers. There was no pain, only a profound gratitude. James stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, a silent, solid presence. "We did it, Marcus," she whispered to the stone. "The journal. It brought down all of it. Corbin will die in a federal prison. The families are safe." "He would be proud of you, Eleanor," James said, his voice a low rumble. "And he'd be so proud of them." He looked down at the twins, who were now a year old, taking wobbly steps in the grass. Marcus Jr. with his father's serious, inquisitive eyes, and Hope with her mother's resilient spirit. They were the legacy. They were the reason. Eleanor rose and took his hand, their fingers lacing together. They stood there for a long moment, not looking at the grave, but out at the sprawling valley below, at the town that was coming back to life, at the future that was theirs to build. The giant who had once been a ghost had finally found his home, not in a hidden sanctuary or the shadows of the past, but here, in the broad, warm light of a new day. And so, the giant who was once a ghost finally found his home in a new sunrise. Their story of survival and sacrifice is complete, but we have one final question for you. It's a simple one. Do you believe James Cain truly found peace in the end? Comment 1 below if you believe he finally healed and found his family. Comment 0 if you believe a man who has seen so much darkness is forever haunted by his ghosts. We're waiting to see what you think. If this story of courage and justice moved you, and you believe that even in the darkest night, a single act of good can change the world, then make sure you subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell.